We're here at the Gratz Brown Library. This is a collection of books relating to American history and American cultural history. It's a private collection that's been amassed over about 15 years from various sources, library book sales, used bookstores. Not much that was bought new, mostly hunting and pecking in bookstores and sales all over the country. And it begins in the colonial days of America and extends into the 21st century, although the focus really is the 18th through the 19th and 20th centuries.
And why that focus?
Well, that relates to the other aspect of this is, besides being a library of information, has to do with the style of the books. And I have a fondness for books that were written in earlier times, particularly from like the World War II era on back. It seems like that was a golden period of historical writing. The writing has much more style. It's probably intended for people that have more leisure time to read. The style is more hurried and more literary, so I'm fonder of the older books than the newer books. That's probably a big part of it. So just to begin, this first shelf is kind of a mixed bag of things. We won't go into this too much, except to say that any collection that would have a book about slavery, a book about the American Indians, and a book about Mae West is obviously encompassing a lot about American life right there. Up here on this top shelf we have kind of general books about America and American government. There's some classics here. There's an old edition of the Federalist Papers, Democracy in America by Tocqueville, The American Commonwealth, which was a book, a study by a British writer of America in the late 19th century, The Rise of American Civilization by Charles Beard, which was a classic of its time, book on this 2-volume set on the Supreme Court, the inaugural addresses of the Presidents of the United States. Now that's something you really want to curl up with at night.
So now, why do you consider these foundational texts, or what is the rationale behind this particular shelf? Why these books?
I would say so, because they're things that you can refer back to really in any period, including now. I mean, you know, Democracy in America by Tocqueville is constantly referred to even now, and just having that kind of set aside from everything else makes it a handy thing that you can go to. Another book, A Constitutional History of the United States, by a man named Professor Laughlin, which is an interesting study of various constitutional issues through American history. That's something I've referred to as well. So it kind of gives a good overview of really any period in American history from, you know, the early Republic on up. I should point out also that this is a reproduction of a cartoon by from the magazine Puck by Joseph Kepler, and there's two actually Puck reproductions here. I'm very fond of the political cartoons of the 19th century, and that's an example of actually one of Thomas Edison pulling a shell game on the American people. Is that once he was this idealist, and now he's just kind of creating these scams to get people's money, which sounds kind of similar to now in some respects.
Well, now, in terms of these foundational texts on the top shelf, have you read all of the books, parts of the books? Do you refer to them as necessary?
More the latter. I have to confess I haven't read them all the way through, but I've read parts of most of them here, of Tocqueville, of Federalist Papers. I've read a lot of this book on constitutional history, so it's something I haven't really read straight. The books I haven't read straight through so much as I kind of refer back to them.
You know, it would be difficult to read probably any of those books straight through. When was the most recent time you referred to any of these on the top shelf?
I think probably Democracy and... Oh, no, it was probably the Constitutional History. I would say that was probably within the last 6 months to a year or so.
And do you remember what prompted you to look up that book?
I've had an interest recently about the writing of the Constitution and what made the cut and what didn't, and how it differed from the Articles of Confederation. So I probably referred to it for that purpose. In fact, there's a bookmark in it. Let's see where the bookmark is. How about that? It is Oh, it's on John Marshall, because I read a biography of Chief Justice John Marshall, and I wanted to see what that author did. And I might make an insertion here in saying that one reason for the really kind of, some would say, excessive amounts of books on American history here is that if you get on a certain tangent, it allows you to kind of like veer in all kinds of different directions and different authors. Like say you read a biography of John Marshall, well you can read what this expert wrote about him or what this expert wrote. And I like the freedom of that. That's a great pleasure for me.
Now, something else that I've heard you say in different contexts is that if you only read contemporary sources, you only get contemporary opinions. And one of the reasons you like 19th century books and also just older out-of-fashion books is you get to review the opinions of earlier generations.
That's true. In a sense, you're reading two things. Let's say that an author in the 1890s is writing a book about the 1790s. You're getting not only a view of what actually happened, but the viewpoint of someone who probably has ideas that are no longer held now. So you're getting kind of this dual sense of what the past was like. By reading some of the more obscure books from earlier eras, you get a sense of the prejudices of the times, of the blind spots, of things that people would notice immediately now that they don't notice now. Some of them are not so nice. They have to do with racial prejudice and ideas about government and about the power of the wealthy that are not as acceptable now as they would have been, let's say, in the 1890s. And reading that is really interesting, no matter what the subject is. To move along a little bit, just to cover this quickly, this is a bit of a deviation. This is more American cultural history here, with a very heavy emphasis on New England in the 19th century and the Transcendentalist movement, which has really interested me in recent years. A lot of books about Ralph Waldo Emerson, a lot of biographies of him, from the 1890s all the way through to, I think, the 1990s. Many of which I've read or read parts of, some of them more assiduously than others, and this is a collection of Emerson's writings here. This is kind of interesting. I might point this one out for the camera. It's actually organized almost the way a Bible would be, or a dictionary, where you can like open it up and turn to, here's Emerson's poems, here's his letters and social aims. And what this implies to me is that this book was really used. This was something that people turned to for wisdom, not just as like period literature. And it gives a sense of what Emerson really meant to people years ago.
And approximately when was that book published?
This was probably the 1920s. We reprinted 1929. So yeah, in the 1920s. So if you were a cultured person, you had something like this on your shelves in those days. We've got Thoreau here. We've got Margaret Fuller, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was a figure of those days.
Was he a transcendentalist?
He was associated with that movement, though he was more of an abolitionist activist, and he also was a leader of a black regiment in the Civil War, and he wrote about that in a very interesting fashion. And a friend of John Brown's, whose books we'll get to later. Going down another shelf, this is more assorted American literary and regional history. A couple of books by Francis Parkman, the great historian, more Emerson here. A lot of books by the literary critic Van Wyck Brooks, who wrote a lot about the literary history of the United States. A wonderful stylist. I'm a big fan of his.
Now, why Parkman and Van Wyck Brooks? What drew you to them?
Their storytelling ability. Parkman, this is only an anthology of some of his pieces. I mean, strictly speaking, I suppose I should have a full set of Parkman here, but you only have so much space, as I'm sure you can realize.
One must always have an aspiration to work towards.
I know, and that's part of the poignancy of this collection, which I'm sure I'll say more about later. This is a 5-volume history that Van Wyck Brooks wrote of American literature, and it's written in a wonderfully narrative style. It's very compelling and very charming, actually. One of my favorite series of books are these here. Some more assorted things. John J. Chapman was an American literary critic and thinker who I'm fond of. These are some first-hand accounts of traveling in the United States in the 19th century, particularly. This is a little earlier. This is the 19th century memories of memorials of a Southern planter, the American scene. That's Henry James. Up in the Old Hotel. This is a little more recent. This is a book from the pieces from basically the 1930s and 40s by the great Joseph Mitchell, who was a writer for the New Yorker. These are wonderful stories. Here's an oddity. This is something you might enjoy. This is a book that actually I bought on my honeymoon up in Maine. It's called Uncle Sham, and it's from India, and it contains various insulting and catty things about the United States, and it was published in India in the 1930s.
Written by?
Written by Kanhali Lal Gaba.
Well, who's the European man in the picture there?
It looks like Hoover, but it could be W.C. Fields.
It is Hoover, President Hoover.
It looks a lot like W.C. Fields, though, which is sort of appropriate. But yeah, it's basically a rather disparaging look at the American culture of the day. Going down here, H.L. Mencken's great multi-volume book on the American language, How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Rice. Carl Carmer, who was a regional writer about New York. I have a number of his books. Also, Stars Fell in Alabama, which is about his time in the Deep South. Oregon Trail, Francis Parkman. More travel books from the 19th century. History of California. This is a book of interest. Old Jewels by Mary Sandoz is a very well-known book about her father, who was a pioneer in western Nebraska, kind of an irascible old cuss, and it's kind of a classic of western literature, one of my favorites. And Inside USA, which is a very well-known book from the 1940s. It's kind of like a reporter's trip around the country, and again, it's a wonderful snapshot of a time, and it reminds you of how people looked at things at the time that you can't really recreate unless you read a book like that.
Okay, so now we have the foundational text on the top. Mm-hmm. We have some oddities on the first shelf. Mm-hmm. Second shelf is the Transcendentalists in large part, mm-hmm. and New England. Mm-hmm. Third is Parkman and Van Wyck Brooks, plus then regional travels, regional reports.
A lot of that, yes.
And then the lower shelf is indeed a large part of H.L. Mencken there, the first mm-hmm. several mm-hmm. Volumes, then going back into more regionalism.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's right.
And so obviously you pointed out that these books were all bought used. Mm-hmm. How did you become aware of wanting, I must have this 150-year-old book? I mean, did it like reach up and grab you out of the bin, or how did the books choose you, or did you choose the books?
A lot of them are well, for instance, sometimes these particular series of books that I would buy be kind of touched up by almost casual circumstance, like in the case of Emerson. This is an Emerson biography here that I bought at a book sale for a couple of dollars. Not one of the better known or better regarded ones, but I found his story so interesting that I said, I'm just going to get as many Emerson books as I can. And so over the next few years, at bookstores and the library sales, I would find them. Generally only pay a few dollars for them, and I'd kind of be off, on that sort of trail. And the hunt of it is a big part of it, too.